This radio show curates Japanese anime culture and economy. TORO Animation Research.
From essential recommendations to obscure trivia, this is Ryota Fujitsu's Anime Lab.
SBS Radio TORO Animation Research Institute. In this segment, our chief researcher, Ryota Fujitsu, will randomly introduce historically significant anime and present anime-related topics in a column-style format. Thank you for joining us.
I'm Ryota Fujitsu, an anime critic. Today we're looking at Mazinger Z and Toys as a historical milestone. But we've received 2 messages, so I'd like to start by introducing those. First up is from Shirotoko Jozu-san in Kita Ward, Hamamatsu City. The Chogokin toys that were popular when I was a kid were truly something I yearned for. That solid, weighty feel and the irresistible name Chogokin really captured my childhood heart. I feel fortunate that I was able to get Mazinger Z, Great Mazinger, Raidin and Grandizer, firing the rocket punch and losing the arm. I think that was a universal experience for kids back then. At the same time, the release of the Jumbo Machinder, those big 60cm figures, was shocking. Those things had sand inside as weights so they could stand up. Robot anime really had that sense of wonder, didn't they?
Sand for weights?
I'll explain this later, but it had iron sand in it. The other thing is, of course, the Chogokin series that was sparked by Mazinger Z, named after Chogokin Z, which was Mazinger's armor setting. The first Mazinger Z figure used zinc alloy, which was quite unusual at the time. The manufacturer was Poppy, I believe. The weight you felt when holding it was in a completely different league from soft vinyl figures. But the problem was the price. I don't remember exactly how much it cost, but I recall it wasn't something you could easily buy with a kid's allowance. The Mazinger Z I was finally able to buy after saving up my allowance for months was truly special. Then, just a few months later, Great Mazinger started airing, and the release of Chogokin Great Mazinger was quite a shock. This message comes from Mr. Masuda in Nagasumi Town.
That was a cruel story, wasn't it?
You could hear a Cruel Angel's thesis playing there, right? Now, there is the issue with new programs, but as we just saw, there was this toy called Chogokin that became incredibly popular in the 70s. This was quite a major epoch in the relationship between anime and toys, so I'd like to talk about that a bit. As we just mentioned, there's Mazinger Z. This show started broadcasting in December 1972. Actually, this is something that everyone surprisingly forgets, but the main sponsor was Otsuka Pharmaceutical. When you think of robot anime, you think of it as a package deal with toys, but...
Right?
People tend to think toy manufacturers were the main sponsors, but children's programs in the 1960s were actually mostly sponsored by food and pharmaceutical companies. Astro Boy's main sponsor was Meiji Confectionery, and Gigantor was sponsored by Glico. That's right, 8-Man was sponsored by Marumia, the rice seasoning company, and the Ultra series was backed by Takeda Pharmaceutical.
It was an approach where kids watching the show would actually eat the products, that kind of thing.
Of course, they were developing toys and other merchandise too, but they weren't the main sponsor. It was simply a matter of licensing out the rights for products to be made. In that sense, Mazinger Z started out the same way, but then Poppy, a company in the Bandai Group, came on board. Looking at the records, they decided to become a merchandising sponsor after watching the screening of episode 1, so their participation came quite late in the game.
You became a sponsor after watching episode 1 of Mazinger Z?
That's right. Since the broadcast was in December, I think we're talking about fall or later. Plus, around this time, Toei was going through labor disputes and the production environment was pretty much in chaos, so it's not like they could get things done that quickly. What kind of company is Poppy? Well, it's a character toy company within the Bandai Group. When we think of toys nowadays, we can only think of toys with strong character tie-ins, right? But it wasn't always like that. Back in the day, there were all kinds of toys with different ways to play, including ones with gameplay elements. And among those were character toys based on TV characters. Before character toys, there was even a term called mass media toys. And
media toy?
And that would be around the 1950s to 1960s. Since they were making toys based on TV characters, it's kind of a dead term now, but there was this sort of thing where they were treated as somewhat second class, you know? Basically, the pure essence of what a toy should be was diluted. So, speaking of character merchandise in the 60s, there were Imai Science's Thunderbirds plastic models and Marusan Shoten's Monster Soft vinyl figures that became absolutely huge hits in the 60s. As character merchandise, I mean. But here's the thing, both companies ended up going bankrupt.
Wait, are you going bankrupt?
You know, character-based stuff really loses popularity and falls flat once the show ends. There's this whole here today, gone tomorrow aspect to it, and back then, character toys weren't really considered mainstream yet. In that sense, Poppy was becoming that particular division within the Bandai Group, so we had to take a somewhat different path from the main company. So right before Mazinger Z, Poppy had this one massive hit, that was the Kamen Rider Transformation Belt. Other companies had put out simpler ones, but they were expensive.
That's a fancy one.
Basically, it's something that recreates the gimmicks from the show. And this became a hit, and then when they moved into planning Mazinger Z in that same vein, two major products were developed. Both became huge hit products. One of them, as we mentioned earlier, was made of polypropylene synthetic resin and stood 60 centimeters tall, the Invincible Champion Jumbo Machinder. At 60 centimeters, it's quite large, you know. Polypropylene is the stuff they used for things like shampoo bottles. Since the inside was hollow and light, they put bags of iron sand in the feet to help with the center of gravity. That's what we were talking about earlier, and that gave it a bit more weight and substance. So this one here, the Mazinger Z robot, is 18 meters in size, and this was a toy that really let you feel that scale. This became a huge hit, selling 700,000 units in 1973 alone and winning the grand prize at the industry toy competition. In that sense, for Poppy, which was somewhat of a minor manufacturer, this was a real home run. Separately from this, what was being developed was something called Chogokin, and as mentioned in the earlier message, they took the name from the fact that Mazinger Z was made of Chogokin Z, creating a die-cast model toy based on zinc alloy. Die-cast is it's the one that uses a solid chunk of metal as is, but this took a long time to develop. Mazinger Z started broadcasting in December 72, which you could basically call 73, yet it took a whole year until February 74. That's over a full year, making it about a year later than the Jumbo Machinder. I guess it was because this was their first time doing something like this. Originally, Poppy had the Popinica brand, which was a miniature car line. They had a lineup of turning vehicles from robot anime into miniature car-type toys. In that sense, they had the technology to make die-cast toys, but then came questions like, what size should we make the robot? Since you can't make everything out of zinc alloy, what do you do about the face and those sharp parts that Mazinger Z has? Working through all these various issues took time, and it finally went on sale in February 74. What was great about this was the sense of weight. It was small and had that precision feel of metal, heavy and cold to the touch. That feeling of this is the real deal. It's a completely different value proposition from size alone. It had this reality to it, like this is what robots are supposed to be like, and this became another massive hit product just like that, February 74, right? By 75, when you talked about Poppy's flagship products, it was all about Chogokin. Even when you looked at toy retailers, there were tons of people asking for it by name. I mean, lots of people would come in asking, do you have any Chogokin? It wasn't people going to toy stores thinking, I wonder if there's something interesting or maybe I can find something to buy for the kids. No, they'd come in specifically asking, do you have any Chogokin? That's the kind of product it had become. Around this time, when it comes to alloy toys as a genre, there's Chogokin. Various manufacturers put out similar products, but in the public eye, they're all called Chogokin. It's the same phenomenon as how every game console gets called a Famicom. It became that kind of major generic term for robot toys. Now, as a major point, by the way, here's a bit of trivia that tends to get mixed up. Poppy had a line called Popinica, so they put out combining robot toys under the Popinica brand. This was separate from the Chogokin brand. It was Popinica. Things like the 5-machine combination of Combat Levi, basically 5 vehicles that combined together, were an extension of the miniature car concept, so these were released under the Popinica brand. I think everyone basically thought of them as Chogokin when they looked at them, and we called them Chogokin too, but they were actually a different brand.
They're all robots, but they differ slightly depending on how they were developed for commercialization.
That's right. The handling within the company was a bit different, but this is how Chogokin became a huge hit product, and one robot after another started being released as Chogokin toys. As a result, by 1975, when it had become their main product, the sponsor's influence had grown significantly. What this meant for toy manufacturers was, with Mazinger Z, there was this robot called Mazinger Z that Gonagai had designed, and they would redesign it for anime use, then base the toys on that, right? But that's not how it worked anymore. They started thinking up transformation gimmicks and basically gimmicks that would make the toys fun to play with first, then figured it would be better to feature those in the anime. It was this kind of Copernican shift that happened.
So it became a paradox then?
That's exactly right. Develop an appealing robot toy and then feature it in an anime. This was the case with Brave Raideen in 1975. Raideen's climactic finishing move involved transforming into a bird-shaped aircraft to deliver its special attack. So the designer at Poppy came up with this transformation gimmick idea, and then Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, who was handling the design work at the time, styled it by suggesting, how about we put it all together with this kind of costume design? The gimmick was being developed by the toy manufacturer, which is how we ended up with the current form of Brave Raideen.
So the toy can actually transform, right?
The selling point was that you could recreate the transformation gimmicks from the show.
Actually, it's the other way around though.
Right. So, Mazinger Z was in 72 and the Chogokin came out in February 74 and Brave Raideen was in 75. So during this period, there was this massive shift in the relationship between robot anime and toys, So that's the kind of story we're talking about here. And from this point on, there's this long relationship with toys, and conversely speaking, there was also the era of tin toys before that. Even though they weren't the main sponsor, various products were being made, so there were all kinds of developments. But today, as one of the turning points in history, we talked about how Mazinger Z's Jumbo Machinder and Chogokin, especially the existence of Chogokin, was epoch-making in the world of robot toys.
By the way, did you have any two Fujitsu-san Super Robot Chogokin figures?
I had a Mazinger Z. I think it was one of the later ones that came out after the Jet Scrander was introduced. It wasn't great Mazinger though.
In terms of texture, today's Super Alloy figures are absolutely incredible, aren't they? What were they like back then?
Back then, it wasn't quite like today's so-called Chogokin Soul series with all that super shiny, sparkly finish and everything. But still, they had that feel where they were heavy and compact, maybe one size up from a toy car. So it really felt like you had the real thing right there in the palm of your hand.
The sizes are getting bigger and bigger these days too, aren't they?
That one has such thorough reproduction of the gimmicks and all that. So yeah, so for me too, it's one of those toys I have a real attachment to.
Yes, I understand. Thank you very much. How did you enjoy this episode of SBS Radio's TORO Animation Institute? TORO Ani is broadcast live every Monday at 7 p.m. on Japan's SBS Radio. Please be sure to tune in. This has been Ryota Aoki, host of SBS Radio's TORO Animation Institute.